September 1944, Eastern France. The greatest military advance in American history was rolling toward Germany like a steel avalanche. Towns were falling in hours. German units were surrendering by the thousands. Patton's Third Army had crossed the Seine, smashed through the Loire, and driven farther in a few weeks than planners in Washington believed possible in months. To the public, it looked like the end of the war was just over the horizon. To the men on the ground, it felt like victory was finally within reach. And then, in the middle of that momentum, a message arrived from Allied headquarters. Fuel allocations to Third Army were being cut. Supply convoys were being redirected. Patton was ordered to slow his advance, hold his positions, and wait. Other Allied armies would receive priority. The spearhead that had been racing toward Germany was suddenly told to stop. An officer who witnessed the moment later recalled Patton, reading the order in silence, his jaw tightening with every line. When he finished, he looked up and said, "They want me to fight a war without gasoline." Another remembered him pacing the room, tapping the map with his riding crop and muttering, "You don't stop an army that's winning. Not unless you want to lose." To Patton, it wasn't just a logistical decision. It was an act of strategic madness. He believed the German army was on the brink of collapse, that one final push could shatter the enemy before winter, before defenses hardened, before politics interfered. And now, at the decisive moment, his own government was putting on the brakes. The official reasoning sounded perfectly rational. Allied supply lines were stretched thin. Ports were overcrowded. Railways had been destroyed by bombing. There wasn't enough fuel and ammunition to keep every army moving at full speed. Decisions had to be made. Priorities had to be set. But Patton didn't see abstract logistics. He saw opportunity slipping away. This is the moment, he told his staff. Right now, not next month. Not next year. The Germans are reeling. If we stop, they recover. If we keep moving, we end it. The order remained the same. Third Army would halt. Resources would go elsewhere. On the map tables at Supreme Allied headquarters, it looked like a reasonable compromise. On the front lines, it felt like sabotage. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to picture the situation as Patton saw it. His armored columns were already deep inside France. German formations were disorganized, retreating, abandoning equipment. Prisoners reported chaos in the enemy rear. Roads to the Rhine lay open. Every mile gained made the next mile easier. Momentum in war is everything. And Patton understood momentum better than any Allied commander. He gathered his senior officers and spoke with blunt intensity. "Gentlemen, they're asking us to pause in the middle of a knockout punch. I don't intend to cooperate with defeat." One cautious colonel reminded him, "Sir, without fuel, tanks don't move." Patton shot back instantly, "Then we'll find fuel." Another officer warned, "These orders come from the highest level." Patton replied, "Then the highest level is wrong." But Patton was also a professional soldier. He wasn't about to stage open rebellion. He understood the chain of command, so he chose a different path, one that would become his trademark. He would obey the order in appearance while defeating it in practice. That decision set the stage for one of the most remarkable acts of stubborn defiance in modern military history. Officially, Third Army slowed. Officially, new offensives were postponed. Officially, Patton accepted the restrictions placed on him. But behind the scenes, a quiet war of improvisation began. He called his logistics officers together and gave them a simple instruction. "I don't care how you do it. Beg, borrow, or steal. Keep this army moving." Supply depots were searched with obsessive intensity. Abandoned fuel stocks were claimed. Captured German gasoline was immediately repurposed for American vehicles. Convoys scheduled for other commands sometimes found themselves mysteriously redirected. Paperwork was adjusted. Rules were bent. Every loophole was exploited. Patton made his intentions clear in private. If they won't give us what we need, we'll take it from the enemy. While higher headquarters believed Third Army was settling into a defensive posture, Patton continued to push forward in small, relentless steps, limited attacks, probing advances, seizures of key road junctions. Nothing large enough to violate orders outright, but enough to keep pressure on the Germans and maintain the initiative. German commanders began to notice something strange. Even when reports said Patton had been stopped, his units somehow kept appearing in new places, farther east than expected. One captured German officer later admitted, "We could never tell when Third Army was supposed to be resting. It never felt like they were resting." Inside Allied command circles, frustration with Patton grew. Some saw him as reckless, insubordinate, impossible to control. Others quietly admired what he was doing, even if they couldn't admit it openly. Patton didn't care about admiration. He cared about results. As September turned into October, the consequences of the forced slowdown began to appear. German defenses stiffened, reinforcements arrived, opportunities that had once been wide open slowly closed. Standing over a map one evening, Patton reportedly said to Bradley, "We had them on the run. Now we're giving them time to breathe." The great advance that might have ended the war in 1944, being strangled by supply decisions made far from the sound of guns. And Patton was not finished fighting that decision, because while Washington believed it had finally restrained him, Patton was already planning something far bolder, something that would prove, in the most dramatic way possible, exactly what he was capable of doing when the world told him to stop. By the autumn of 1944, the Allied High Command was locked in a quiet argument that would shape the rest of the war. On the surface, everyone agreed on the objective: defeat Germany as quickly as possible. Beneath that agreement, a deep strategic divide was growing. It wasn't just a disagreement about tactics, it was a clash of philosophies. At Supreme Headquarters, planners believed in a broad front strategy. All Allied armies would advance together, keeping pressure along the entire line. No single commander would receive overwhelming priority. Resources would be divided carefully to maintain balance. It was safe, it was orderly, it was politically sensible. Patton despised it. He believed wars were not won by balance. They were won by concentration of force, by speed, by decisive blows delivered at the right moment. In his mind, the German army in France was already broken. The only thing holding it together was time. And every day that the Allies slowed down gave the enemy another chance to rebuild. During one heated meeting with senior officers, Patton made his position brutally clear. "You don't win wars by spreading yourself thin," he said. "You win by hitting the enemy where he's weakest and hitting him again before he can recover." But the decision had already been made. Bernard Montgomery in the north was preparing his own grand offensive toward the Netherlands and Germany. Eisenhower believed Montgomery needed priority for Operation Market Garden. That meant fuel, trucks, and ammunition had to be diverted away from Patton. On a map in a headquarters tent, the logic looked clean and rational. In the mud of France, it looked very different. Patton tried to explain this to anyone who would listen. He argued that his Third Army was already positioned for a direct thrust into Germany's industrial heartland. He warned that slowing down now would allow the Germans to reinforce the Siegfried Line, rebuild shattered divisions, and turn a war of movement into a war of attrition. "We have them reeling," he told Bradley. "Another hard push and they'll break completely." Bradley sympathized but could only shrug. "The decision comes from above, George. We all have to live with it." Patton's frustration was not just strategic, it was personal. He had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of rapid, aggressive warfare. His army was built for speed. His commanders were trained to exploit breakthroughs. Now, At the moment when everything he believed in was working, he was being told to sit still. Officers close to him remembered how deeply it bothered him. One aide recalled Patton staring at a map late at night and saying quietly, "This war isn't going to end because someone filled out the right form. It's going to end because someone had the courage to finish it." The collision between logistics and ambition was becoming impossible to ignore. Allied supply lines truly were strained. Ports in France were clogged. Rail networks had been bombed into ruins. Trucks were wearing out faster than they could be replaced. Every army group demanded more than the system could deliver. From a purely administrative perspective, cutting Patton's fuel made sense. From Patton's perspective, it was madness. He believed logistics should serve strategy, not control it. To him, the purpose of supply was to support victory, not to ration it. "Give me gasoline," he once said, "and I'll give you Germany." Instead, he was being given excuses. So Patton began fighting a different kind of war, a bureaucratic war. If official channels wouldn't provide what he needed, unofficial ones would. His headquarters turned into a hive of creative problem-solving. Officers were dispatched to hunt for forgotten depots, overlooked shipments, and unused stockpiles. Quartermasters became magicians, somehow producing fuel and ammunition that higher headquarters insisted didn't exist. Patton encouraged this behavior openly. "Don't tell me why something can't be done," he told them. "Tell me how you're going to do it anyway." Meanwhile, the Germans took full advantage of the Allied slowdown. Intelligence reports began to show enemy units regrouping, repairing equipment, and digging new defensive positions. The very collapse Patton had predicted in August was being reversed in October. He watched it happen with growing anger. At one staff conference, he slammed his fist on the table and said, "Every gallon of gas we don't use today is another American life we'll lose tomorrow." Yet even under restrictions, Third Army continued to achieve results. Patton's forces captured key cities, cleared fortified positions, and kept grinding forward inch by inch. But the rapid exploitation he dreamed of, the lightning drive to the Rhine, remained out of reach. Other Allied commanders began to question whether Patton was exaggerating the opportunity he claimed to see. Some suggested his constant demands were simply ambition talking. A British officer reportedly remarked, "Patton always believes the war can be won next week." Patton heard those comments and dismissed them. "They think I'm impatient," he told a friend. "I'm not impatient. I'm urgent." There's a difference. The tension reached its peak in early November when Patton requested a massive fuel allocation for a renewed offensive toward the German border. The request was denied. Priority would remain elsewhere. To many men, that decision might have marked the end of the argument. To Patton, it only hardened his resolve. He gathered his corps commanders and delivered a message that revealed exactly how he intended to proceed. "We may not have everything we want," he said, "but we're going to use everything we've got. We will keep moving. We will keep fighting. And we will be ready when the moment comes." That moment was closer than anyone realized, because while Allied planners debated charts and tonnage reports, Germany was preparing a desperate gamble of its own. In the forests of the Ardennes, far from Patton's front, Hitler was assembling the last major offensive of the war, and when that storm finally broke, it would prove beyond any doubt whether Patton had been reckless or right all along. By late November 1944, the slowdown imposed on Third Army was no longer a theoretical problem. It was showing up on every map, in every after-action report, and in the growing casualty lists. German units that had been shattered in August were now reorganized. Defensive lines that might have been overrun in days were turning into stubborn obstacles. The very delay Patton had warned about was becoming reality. Inside his headquarters near Nancy, Patton studied the situation with restless intensity. He understood something many politicians and planners refuse to admit: wars have moments, brief windows when everything is possible. Miss those windows and the cost of victory multiplies. We had them on the ropes, he told one of his division commanders. Now they're learning how to fight again. Yet Patton refused to accept the idea that his army was finished as an offensive force. If he couldn't launch the massive, fuel-hungry drive he wanted, he would fight a different way. He began to reshape his tactics to fit the constraints forced upon him. Instead of grand armored thrusts, Third Army shifted to a relentless pattern of small, sharp attacks. Limited objectives, local breakthroughs, constant pressure. Patton called it keeping the enemy off balance. We may be short on gasoline, he said, but we are not short on aggression. Psychological warfare became one of his primary weapons. He ordered artillery barrages timed to confuse German units, night movements designed to make his forces appear larger than they were, and rapid redeployments that kept enemy commanders guessing where the next blow would fall. Captured German officers later admitted that even during the supposed pause, they never felt safe facing Patton. One interrogation report noted a German colonel saying, "With other American armies, we could rest between battles. With Patton, there was no rest." The friction with Allied leadership, however, continued to grow. At SHAEF headquarters, some officers began to see Patton as more trouble than he was worth. He complained too much, he demanded too much, he pushed too hard. Eisenhower valued him as a battlefield commander but worried constantly about his unpredictability. More than once, there were quiet discussions about whether Third Army needed to be brought under tighter control. Patton sensed it all. During a tense phone call with a senior logistics officer, he snapped, "You're treating this like a shipping problem. I'm treating it like a war." Bradley tried to mediate between Patton and higher headquarters, but even he struggled to keep the peace. He admired Patton's energy and brilliance, yet he also knew the political realities. "George," Bradley told him, "sometimes you have to fight the war you're given, not the one you want." Patton's answer was blunt. "Then I'll change the war I'm given." And that was exactly what he attempted to do. He began reorganizing his supply system with ruthless efficiency. Trucks were pulled from non-essential duties and reassigned to ammunition and fuel hauling. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep vehicles running. Captured German equipment was pressed into service. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was allowed to sit idle. He even ordered that damaged tanks beyond repair be stripped down so their fuel could be drained and reused. "A dead tank can still help win a battle," he told his mechanics. At the same time, Patton kept pushing his commanders to act boldly within their limits. "Don't tell me what you can't do," he said repeatedly. "Tell me what you can do." This attitude filtered through the entire army. Officers learned to think creatively, to exploit small opportunities, to fight for every yard even when the grand offensive was on hold. The culture Patton built was one of constant motion, constant pressure. German intelligence noticed. Reports from the period described Third Army as aggressive beyond expectation. Despite apparent supply shortages, the enemy never knew when a limited attack might suddenly turn into something larger. Yet the cost of delay kept mounting. By early December, Patton was convinced that Germany was preparing something major. Reconnaissance reports suggested unusual troop movements opposite the Ardennes. He warned higher headquarters that the enemy was not beaten, that a counterstroke was coming. Few listened. Many believed the German army was too weak for another large offensive. They saw the war as essentially decided. Patton did not share that optimism. "They're wounded," he told his staff, "and wounded animals are the most dangerous." Then, on December 16, 1944, the storm broke. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, Germany launched a massive surprise attack. Entire American divisions were caught off guard. Front lines collapsed. Chaos spread across the Allied command. The very broad front strategy that had slowed Patton now seemed fragile and exposed. At SHAEF headquarters, panic set in. Eisenhower needed a commander who could react instantly, decisively, without hesitation. He needed someone who could move an army faster than anyone thought possible. He needed Patton. While others scrambled to understand the situation, Patton had already been planning. He had anticipated the possibility of a German attack and prepared contingency options. When Eisenhower called for help, Patton famously answered with calm confidence, "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. Staff officers were stunned. Such a maneuver seemed impossible. Patton simply replied, "I've already arranged it." In that moment, months of frustration, improvisation, and relentless preparation came together. The army that Washington had tried to slow down was about to prove exactly what it could do when unleashed. The crisis in the Ardennes would become the ultimate test of Patton's methods and the final proof that stopping him in 1944 had been a mistake with enormous consequences. December 1944, the Ardennes. Snow fell across the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg as American units retreated in confusion. German armored columns punched through thinly held lines, driving toward the Meuse River. Towns changed hands in hours. Entire Allied plans seemed to be unraveling. What had been a confident march toward Germany suddenly turned into a desperate struggle to survive. At Supreme Headquarters, the atmosphere was grim. Maps were covered with red arrows marking German advances. Reports came in of surrounded divisions, lost supply depots, and shattered communications. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and for a few terrifying days, no one knew where it would end. In the middle of that chaos, one man remained calm. When Eisenhower summoned his senior commanders to discuss the crisis, Patton arrived already prepared. While others were still trying to grasp the scale of the disaster, Patton had studied his maps, reviewed his options, and quietly drafted plans. Eisenhower asked the room a simple question: who can turn north and attack immediately to relieve Bastogne? Before anyone else could answer, Patton spoke. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room fell silent. Moving an entire army on such short notice was considered logistically impossible. Roads were clogged, fuel was scarce. Winter weather made movement treacherous, yet Patton said it with complete confidence. One skeptical officer asked, "Have you already made the arrangements?" Patton replied without hesitation, "I've made them." What no one outside 3rd Army headquarters knew was that Patton had anticipated this very scenario. For weeks he had suspected the Germans were planning something in the Ardennes. Quietly, without fanfare, he had ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for a rapid pivot north. While other armies assumed the front was stable, Patton had been thinking 3 moves ahead. Now those preparations would pay off. Within hours of receiving Eisenhower's approval, 3rd Army began one of the most extraordinary maneuvers of the war. Entire corps turned 90 degrees on icy roads. Supply routes were reorganized overnight. Units that had been facing east toward Germany suddenly found themselves racing north toward Belgium. It was a logistical miracle built on months of discipline and improvisation. Patton drove his staff relentlessly. "We're not just moving an army," he told them. "We're saving one." Fuel, the very resource that had been denied to him for months, was now rushed to 3rd Army with urgent priority. The same headquarters that had once ordered him to slow down now begged him to move faster. Tank columns rolled through snowstorms. Engineers repaired bridges under enemy fire. Artillery units repositioned in record time. What planners said would take a week was done in days. German commanders were stunned. They had expected Allied forces to take weeks to respond to the surprise offensive. Instead, Patton's troops appeared on their flank almost immediately. On December 26, 1944, the lead elements of 3rd Army broke through to Bastogne, relieving the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. The crisis that had threatened to split the Allied front was halted. Patton had delivered exactly what he promised. One of Eisenhower's aides later admitted, no other commander in the Allied armies could have done what Patton did that week. The relief of Bastogne became more than just a tactical victory. It was proof that speed, aggression, and preparation mattered more than cautious planning. Proof that Patton's philosophy of relentless momentum was not reckless, it was effective. As Third Army continued to attack, the German offensive slowly collapsed. The last great gamble of Hitler's war ended in failure, and the man who had been told to stop only months earlier had become the key to Allied survival. Inside his headquarters, Patton allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. "They tried to put us on a leash," he told his staff. "Turns out we were the only ones ready to run." The events of the Bulge changed everything. No one at Schaeff talked anymore about slowing Patton down. No one questioned his constant demands for fuel and freedom of action. The crisis had settled the argument in the most decisive way possible. When the snow finally melted and the Allied advance resumed in early 1945, Patton was given the resources he had begged for the previous year. Third Army surged forward again, crossing the Rhine, overrunning German positions, and driving deep into the collapsing Reich. Many historians would later argue that the delay forced on Patton in September 1944 had prolonged the war by months. The Bulge, they said, was the direct consequence of giving Germany time to recover. Patton believed that to his dying day. Standing over a map in the spring of 1945, watching his armies pour in Germany, he reportedly remarked, "Imagine where we'd be if they hadn't stopped us." But the war was not yet over, and one final chapter remained: the question of what Patton's defiance had truly accomplished, and what it revealed about leadership, responsibility, and the cost of hesitation. By the spring of 1945, the argument was effectively over. The restrictions that had once strangled Third Army were gone. Fuel flowed freely. Supplies arrived in abundance. Patton, finally unleashed without limits, drove his forces through the heart of Germany with the speed he had dreamed of the previous autumn. City after city fell. Entire German armies surrendered to him in staggering numbers. The war in Europe collapsed in a matter of weeks. Looking back, it became impossible to ignore the lesson of what had happened. When Patton had been slowed in September 1944, the German army had been at its weakest point since the beginning of the war. Their defenses were shattered, their logistics broken, their morale crumbling. Every day of delay allowed them to rebuild just enough to fight again. That rebuilding led directly to the desperate gamble in the Ardennes, and that gamble cost tens of thousands of Allied casualties. Patton never forgot that chain of cause and effect. After the war, he spoke bitterly about those months. "We had the enemy down," he said to a reporter, "and instead of finishing him, we gave him time to get back on his feet." Historians still debate whether Patton could truly have ended the war in 1944 if he had been fully supported. Logistics were undeniably strained. The Allied coalition was complex. Political considerations mattered. No single commander, no matter how brilliant, controlled every variable. But what cannot be debated is this: when his own government tried to stop him, Patton refused to accept paralysis. He did not resign in frustration. He did not collapse under restrictions. He did not hide behind excuses. Instead, he adapted. He improvised. He found ways to keep fighting even when the system told him to slow down. What Patton did after his own side tried to stop him was simple in principle and extraordinary in execution. He kept moving anyway. He turned limitations into challenges. He treated obstacles as problems to be solved. He used creativity where others used caution. He fought two wars at once, one against the Germans and another against the inertia of his own bureaucracy. And when the decisive crisis arrived in December 1944, he was ready in a way no other commander was. The pivot to Bastogne, the rapid redeployment of an entire army, the ability to strike back in days instead of weeks, all of it grew directly out of the mindset he had maintained during those frustrating months of enforced slowdown. In the end, Patton was not vindicated by speeches or memos. He was vindicated by results. The very leaders who had once tried to restrain him came to depend on him more than anyone else. The army that had been ordered to halt became the army that saved the Allied position in its darkest hour. The general considered too aggressive became the general who prevented catastrophe. There is a powerful leadership lesson buried in that story. Organizations often try to slow their most driven people. Systems value caution over urgency. Committees prefer balance to boldness. And sometimes those instincts are wise, but in moments of crisis, progress belongs to those willing to push forward even when told to wait. Patton understood something fundamental. Momentum lost in war is paid for in blood later. He refused to be the man who allowed that to happen without a fight. He was not perfect. He was abrasive, controversial, often politically careless. He ignored advice he didn't like. He angered allies as easily as enemies. But when history demanded action instead of hesitation, he acted. That is what he did after his own government tried to stop him. He did not accept delay as destiny. He did not confuse orders with outcomes. He remembered that the purpose of an army is to win wars, not to follow procedures comfortably. And because of that stubborn determination, when the moment of truth arrived in the Ardennes, the Allies had one commander ready to do the impossible. Today, the story raises questions that reach far beyond the battlefields of World War II. When a system tells you to slow down at the very moment opportunity appears, do you obey without question? When bureaucracy collides with urgency, which side should win? Is loyalty to orders more important than loyalty to results? Patton believed results mattered most. Whether you admire him or criticize him, one fact remains undeniable. The war ended sooner because when told to stop, George S. Patton found ways to keep going. So here is the final question for you. If you were in his position facing limits imposed by your own side while victory hung in the balance, would you have obeyed quietly? Or would you have done what Patton did and fought on anyway? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories about bold decisions, controversial leaders, and the moments that changed history, subscribe now.